Bien. Alors, j'ai le grand plaisir, le grand honneur d'accueillir aujourd'hui dans notre séminaire Vygotsky Paul Harris. Je vais le présenter brièvement. Donc, Paul Harris est psychologue. Ses intérêts de recherche portent sur le développement de la cognition, de l'émotion et de l'imagination chez l'enfant. Durant les années 80, il a travaillé plus particulièrement sur la compréhension des enfants concernant les états mentaux, y compris l'émotion. Il a publié 2 livres qui traitent de cette question, notamment un livre qui s'intitule Children and Emotion. Et il a également, dans les années 90, il s'est plus particulièrement focalisé sur le développement du jeu de faire semblant et de l'imagination. Et il a publié un livre traduit en français et dans de nombreuses autres langues qui s'intitule en français « L'imagination chez l'enfant ». Et actuellement, il est professeur à Harvard depuis 2001. Et actuellement, donc, il étudie dans quelle mesure les enfants se fient à leurs propres observations directes ou au contraire à ce que les autres leur disent, en particulier lorsqu'ils essayent de comprendre un domaine de connaissance dans lequel l'observation directe est difficile. Ce champ d'études est particulièrement intéressant, me semble-t-il, à une époque saturée de théories complotistes, de fake news ou autres bullshit. And now it's your turn to speak, Paul.
Thank you, Daniel, for this introduction. So let me get moving straight away. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the history of thinking about the imagination. And this is an enormous simplification, but it will help me to situate my own particular perspective. So I think at the beginning of the 20th century, 2 very different thinkers, Piaget and Freud, offered a somewhat negative perspective on the imagination in the sense that they tended to think that young children's fantasy and imagination doesn't serve much of an intellectual or cognitive purpose, and if anything, in the course of development, is displaced by greater objectivity or ego-based rationality in the case of Freud. So if you look at the early writings of Piaget, that's essentially the perspective that you get. Even when you look at La formation du symbole chez l'enfant, the play Dreams and Imitation in English, you see echoes of this somewhat negative stance toward the imagination. It's not seen as a function that will continue into maturity. Now, if we look at contemporary theorizing, and here I'm talking primarily about theorizing in the Anglo-Saxon world, I know less about what is happening in Europe, but there may be some parallels. At any rate, in the Anglo-Saxon world, partly inspired by Vygotsky, there's a much more positive view of children's imagination and a good deal of interest, particularly among early childhood educators, in the possibility that giving children opportunities, encouraging opportunities for them to engage in pretend play will bring various cognitive benefits, especially in the domain of so-called executive control or executive function. Actually, as I think about it, you do have a representative of that particular way of thinking in Switzerland. So Professor Perron in the University of Constance and her team have been doing some interesting work looking at the extent to which pretend play can be boosted in preschool groups and looking at the potential consequences of supplying that boost. Now, My own view is different in the sense that I don't think that we should emphasize too much the what can we say, the exotic or romantic features of children's play. I'm much more interested in the fact that children's imagination is very much grounded based on their knowledge of reality. In other words, when children play a pretend game, as I'll show you in a moment, I don't think they stray very far from what they know to be the case about the real world. And in fact, there's another aspect of Vygotsky, which I'm sure you'll be talking about today and tomorrow. I'm thinking in particular of his paper, which was published in English at least in 2004, where he talks about the relationship between the imagination and reality. And to be honest, I had not read this paper until very recently, and was pleasantly surprised and pleasantly disconcerted, in fact, to see how many parallels and echoes there were between the conclusions that Vygotsky reached back in 1930 and the conclusions that I have struggled towards, so to speak, here in the 21st century. So with that background, let me now give you a quick overview of the topics I'll talk about. And I want to talk very quickly about 5 different topics: pretend play, children's anticipation of the future, their ideas about what can happen and what cannot happen, their creativity as displayed by their ability to make a tool for a new purpose. And finally, I'll talk about their drawing. As I say, I will move fairly quickly, but I hope to give you a canvas of this realist view. So here's an experiment I did some years ago together with a good colleague and student, Bob Kavanagh and Judith Meredith. And we were testing 2-year-olds. And essentially in the experiment, we would act out a little make-believe episode in front of them. So the child watched as we picked up a milk carton that was empty and tipped it or poured from it in a pretend gesture, implying that some liquid would fall out of the container, out of the carton, and then fall into a container. And then this container was carried over to a toy horse and turned upside down, with the implication, of course, that the milk inside the container would now pour over the toy horse. So this was one group of children. They saw, as it were, the milk episode. Here's another group of children, very similar, but in a critical way different. They saw a can of talcum powder shaken, in other words, implying that powder was going to go into the container. And then just in the same way as these children, they saw that container carried over to a toy horse and tipped upside down. Now notice that at the end here, the situation is exactly the same. There's a toy horse who, of course, looks just the same before the tipping of the container and after the tipping of the container, because there's no milk and there's no powder. But we can ask the children in each case what they think has happened. And you see that the 2 groups of children give us different answers. The horse is wet or milky, got milk on, covered in milk, or the horse is dry, powdery, got powder on him, covered in powder, and so forth. Now, in a way, this seems very simple and predictable, but I want you to reflect a little bit on what must be going on in the child's mind in order to differentiate between these 2 episodes. In particular, I'm arguing that in order to understand these episodes, the child has to take their knowledge of reality and transpose it over to this make-believe world. Their knowledge of reality, for example, includes the fact that when you have liquid in a container, and when you tip the container, the liquid will fall out. Let me go back. When you see liquid coming out of a container, what direction does it go in? Well, it doesn't go upwards or sideways, it falls down. And how exactly does it fall down? Well, it falls in a straight line. And what happens to it? Well, it wets the surface underneath. Or if it's powder, it powders the surface underneath. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that even 2-year-olds are using their knowledge of naive physics, what happens to surfaces and what happens to liquids, in order to make sense of the pretend episode. And they do it in a very targeted way, figuring out, well, if milk goes into this container and then is carried over somewhere else, the horse will have a particular wet result. Conversely, understanding that if powder is put in the container, the horse will have a powdery result. So this is a mini glimpse of a body of works that I carried out in collaboration with various colleagues, showing that even if we think of pretend play as a kind of fantasy, that fantasy is imbued through and through with the child's naive understanding of the way the world works, including, as I say, liquids and containers and gravity and the rest of it. So there's a quick example of the way in which reality and imagination are in close collaboration. If we study in a more observational mode children's pretend activities, what we see, and this is a quotation from Inge Bretherton, who synthesized a lot of work in the 1980s and 1970s, that children's pretending often is based on their everyday scripts, everyday regularities, sleeping, eating, telephoning, going for a ride, and so forth. And it turns out that when we go outside of Western industrialized communities, we see roughly the same thing. So this is a study done in the Congo Basin rainforest of the Central African Republic. It was an observational study. Children were watched for 3 hours per day. And these children devote a lot of their play to pretend play, more specifically, as opposed to climbing trees and so forth. What do we see? Well, actually, here's Adam Boyette. He's slightly tired from chasing after these children, as you see, taking a break. What we see them doing is what Bretherton describes. We see them reenacting domestic workaday activities, fetching water, pretend cooking, pretend chopping, pretend gathering of inedible foods, pretend hunting, and pretend cutting or planting. So, a quick conclusion: when children make sense of a play partner, they use their knowledge of everyday reality, its causal and cultural regularities. And when they produce pretend play, their departures from ordinary, familiar scripts is rare. They tend to engage in the kinds of activities they've seen adults around them engaged in. They rarely create a fantastical world. So early pretend play, here's my first topic, is infused with knowledge of reality. Now let's move on to imagining the future. Well, you might think that I'm implying that children are limited because they are so reality-based, but I think that would be a mistake. Being reality-based is actually very helpful, because if you're trying to think about what will happen in the future, it's often extremely helpful to think about what's happened in the past and to anticipate that, no doubt with certain changes, the future will echo and reproduce what's happened in the past. So, in other words, if the child were prone to fantasy and drew on fantasy in imagining the future, they would likely be less accurate in anticipating what is going to happen. It turns out that when we study adults who have memory problems, difficulty in retrieving the past, those very adults have difficulty in imagining what the future holds. So there is among adults a very close relationship between remembering the past and anticipating the future. Similarly, we see a correlational link among children in the sense that if we take a given age group, let's say 5-year-olds, and we get them to recall episodes from the past, those children who do so with greater richness and more detail turn out to be able to envision the future with greater richness and more detail. This correlation has emerged among preschoolers and among older children. So just as we see with brain-damaged adults, this close relationship between memory for the past and thinking about the future, so with memory-based evidence, we see a close relationship between the richness of children's memories and the richness of their anticipation of the future. So imagining the future, closely linked to remembering the past, and I could say, of course, closely linked to remembering past reality, not past fantasy. Okay, let's turn to the third theme, judging what is possible. So here I'm going to ask, what do children know about not necessarily what is likely to happen or what will happen, but let's ask them about what can possibly happen. So there was a very nice study done some years ago by Andrew Stulman and Susan Carey, in which they tested adults and children ranging from 4 through 8 with a storybook. And in the storybook, there was a mixture of different kinds of events. Some of these were very straightforward, possible events. Here's an example, eating an apple. So there will be a picture of a boy eating an apple. Some of the events would, Some of the events were impossible, such as walking through a brick wall. Some of the events were not impossible, but extremely unlikely, such as finding an alligator under the bed. So just to show you, here's the kind of picture the child would see with respect to an unlikely event, finding an alligator under the bed. Here's the illustration of another impossible event, eating lightning for dinner. Okay, in each case, the child was asked to say whether the event was possible. And here I've plotted the mean number of ordinary, improbable, and impossible events that the child judged to be possible. So let's concentrate on the red line first and on the green line. So you can see that children judge ordinary events, to be much more possible than impossible events, such as eating lightning for dinner or walking through a brick wall. And that makes sense. And as you can see also, there's actually no age change. The results are very similar, whether we're talking about 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and adults, and typically when we talk about ordinary events. So in other words, we have children at an early age making a pretty clear distinction between what is possible and what is not possible. However, if you look at the blue line, the story is actually more complicated in the sense that 4-year-olds often say that it's impossible for something that is improbable to happen. So to put it in concrete terms, if you said to them, would it be possible for there to be an alligator under your bed? They would say, no, that could never happen. But as you can also see, as time goes on and they get older, children are more accepting of the possibility of such remote and unlikely events. They increasingly recognize that the improbable, the unlikely, can in principle occur. So I've just gone through those claims, especially the age change with respect to the improbable events. So why do they show this particular pattern? Well, my interpretation is that when children are asked what can happen, they draw on their imagination. And their imagination, as I've just argued, is based very much on their memory for the past. So, asked if someone could eat an apple, they can easily imagine someone doing that. They've seen it many times before, and they say, yes, that's possible. Asked if someone could walk through a brick wall or eat lightning for dinner, they cannot imagine that happening. They can't construct an appropriate mental representation. They've never seen it happening before. They know that walls are solid and so forth. So they are correct in judging it to be impossible. But now think about very, very rare events. Asked if someone could find an alligator under their bed, they also, in this case too, fail to construct an appropriate representation. They've never seen alligators under beds. And given their previous experience, therefore, they incorrectly judge that such an outcome is impossible. So here we see in the younger children a very nice illustration of the way in which in some ways, their sense of possibility is limited because their realist imagination, their reality-based imagination, is rather conservative. It tells them that such and such a thing could not happen insofar as it's never happened in the past. As we see, that error is less frequent as children get older, presumably because children increasingly realize that they have to take causal considerations into account. Something may be very unlikely, but there's no causal law which prevents it from happening. Okay, so there's a summary of my claim about judgments of possibility. And summarizing, when children are invited to judge what is possible, they are error prone if they're younger and conservative, given their limited imagination, which is, to echo the point one more time, based on perception of past reality. Okay, let's now move on to creativity as exemplified in two different ways by children's ability to manufacture or make a simple tool and their ability to draw something that they've never seen before. So maybe before I show you that slide, I'll just say a little bit about tool making. So, of course, we know that human beings are very good at making tools, but we're not alone on the planet in being tool makers. In the past 20 years or so, lots of work with chimpanzees showing that they too manufacture tools, although rather simple tools. And we even know that crows can make a tool such as a hook. And in fact, the experiments that I'm going to show you in a moment were based in part on work not with chimpanzees, but with crows. There's a very famous little video of a crow called Betty, who's trying to extract a reward, but can't get her beak inside the tube. And she picks up a piece of wire in her beak, pushes the piece of wire against a surface so that the end of the wire bends into a hook. Then she dips the hook into the tube and manages to extract the reward. If you go online, you'll find this genius crow called Betty demonstrating that feat. Okay, so we can ask about children, are they able to do such problem solving? So this is a very nice study done by Sarah Beck in the UK and her colleagues. The children are shown a sticker which is placed in a little bucket, and the bucket is then placed down at the bottom of a narrow plastic cylinder. The children can't put their hand in the cylinder because it's too narrow for them. It won't allow them to put their hand in. So they have to think of a way of getting this sticker, perhaps using a tool or some kind of aid. They're given the possibility of making a tool because they're given either a straight pipe cleaner or a hooked pipe cleaner. Sorry, in this particular setup, the children don't have to make the tool. They're presented with a ready-made appropriate tool, namely a hooked pipe cleaner. And indeed, under these circumstances, children are very good. They choose the hooked pipe cleaner, put it in the tube or cylinder, and extract the bucket and win the sticker. On the other hand, in this setup, children have to make the tool. So they're offered a straight pipe cleaner, and alongside that straight pipe cleaner as a distractor, they're shown a piece of string, and they're asked, well, can you win the sticker by getting it out by lifting the bucket? The results were, in this second setup, rather surprising. Virtually none of the 3 to 5-year-olds managed to take this straight pipe cleaner and bend it into a hook. And even among 5 to 7-year-olds, fewer than half were successful. So here are the results. As you can see, a steady increase with age in the probability of success. But even here, among 7 and 8-year-olds, half of the children are failing. And as you see, among the 3 to 5-year-olds, more than 90% are failing to make the hook. Something, as I just mentioned a moment ago, a crow could do. Okay. So one possible explanation for this limitation among young children is that in the West, in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, children have lots of prefabricated toys. So they rarely make things for themselves. And to that extent, then, creative activities, making things with matchsticks, matchboxes, shoeboxes, candles, string, and so forth, maybe not part of their repertoire. So in Australia, Mark Nielsen and his colleagues speculated that children who didn't have access to prefabricated toys might be more ingenious, more inventive, more creative. So they compared middle-class children in Brisbane with children in South Africa from Bushman communities. So just to show you, here's one of the Bushman children they have in mind. No toys to play with, but rescues an abandoned tire and some sticks, and has invented a playful activity with that combination. So the idea was that these children, these Bushman children, would do better than the middle-class Brisbane children on the hook task. Here's a child attempting it, as you can see, and in fact, about to succeed. This must be an older child. Okay. What they found was essentially the same results as Sarah Beck did in the United Kingdom. So when given the straight pipe cleaner, very few children realize that they could make a hook out of it. If they see a demonstration of making a hook, then children immediately do much better. So in other words, whilst they can't think of the idea for themselves, if given the idea, they are pretty good. They are copiers rather than inventors. More importantly, for the rationale of the study, there was actually no difference between the middle-class Brisbane children and the Bushman children. They were both poor at doing it on their own, but once shown a hook, they were good at copying that activity and retrieving the reward. So to summarize, and I'm limiting myself here to these two studies. There are plenty of other studies out there in the literature these days. It's a lively research area. And I think my summary does justice to the range of findings. Young children are excellent copiers. When they see somebody solve a problem by creating a tool, they readily do the same. However, if they don't have a demonstration and the solution depends on their own spontaneous tool innovation, very few are successful. And that conclusion applies to children in urban communities and in poor rural communities as well. You see the same combination: faithful imitation on the one hand, limited innovation on the other hand. So innovation in tool manufacture, rare in young children unless prompted by a model or demonstration. So at least if we look at tool manufacture, young children are not creative. They are dependent on guidance from more successful adults or older children or experts. Okay, let me turn now to the final topic, drawing what does not exist. And there's been a great deal of research in developmental psychology on drawing skills. And as I think about it, the research tradition, I started in France, in Paris, with Luque, who studied the drawing development of his own daughter. And he emphasized the gradual development of his daughter's figurative skills. And more recent research has emphasized the same aspect, that children attempt to draw something that they're familiar with, something that they know, but when they try to transpose a three-dimensional object, be it a man or a house, onto the page, there's a challenge because the page is two-dimensional and not three-dimensional. So in that context, Annette Karmeloff-Smith invited children to do something unusual. Rather than to draw something that they knew about, which was, as I say, the standard inclination of children in most of the previous research studies, Karmeloff-Smith invited children to do something different, to draw a man that doesn't exist. I say draw a man that doesn't exist. She also asked them to draw a house that doesn't exist, an animal that doesn't exist, but the results were similar across those three different entities. And to make the situation clear to the children, they were given various helpful hints about what she meant by a man that doesn't exist. She would say, you know, a man you invent, a pretend man, a man we've never seen before. And then the child was given pencil and paper and asked to proceed. So what did she find? Now you can already guess what I'm going to predict. Insofar as the child has a limited imagination and typically draws on their realist imagination in order to produce a prediction about the future, a new tool, or indeed a drawing, I'm going to predict that young children will find this task challenging. And indeed, that is what Karmeloff-Smith found. If we take the older children, 8 to 10-year-olds, they were pretty good. So they adopted various strategies, for example, adding a new element, such as an extra head. Here's a nice example of a 9-year-old who's created a two-headed man and indeed a three-legged man. So that was one strategy, add extra elements. Alternatively, they would take two elements and swap places, move them from one place to the other. For example, arms and legs. So here's an example, again, a 9-year-old, and you can see that this right-hand arm, this right-hand leg is misplaced, And again, the right-hand arm is misplaced. They've been transposed, these two. Actually, as I look at it, I see again also that the head has been displaced sideways. So displacement of elements or transposition of elements was strategy number 2. Sometimes, and if anything, this is the strategy which I think is the most intriguing. Children drew from 2 different categories and brought them together to create a sort of hybrid. So here's a nice illustration. You can see that Dominic has produced a kind of centaur creature, the torso of a man, and the body of a horse, I presume it is. Okay, so those are the 3 strategies we see among the older children: extra elements, transposition, fusion into a centaur-like creature. However, very few of the younger children manage these kinds of solutions. Here are the findings with 4 to 6-year-olds in blue and 8 to 10-year-olds in orange. And you can see that these solutions are pretty widespread among the older children and rather rare among the younger children. Now, in thinking about her results, Carmeloff Smith focused on the actual process of or skill of drawing. And she said that maybe the younger children suffer from the following difficulty. They have a kind of script or routine for drawing a man. You start with a big circle, then you put another circle underneath, and then you put 2 lines to show the legs, and then you put 2 other lines to show the arms. And she speculated that this script or routine became, so to speak, over-practiced, so that children couldn't alter it. They couldn't adjust it so as to accommodate change, effectively preventing them from drawing something that they had not been seen before. So in other words, they would start to draw, perhaps aiming to draw a man that doesn't exist, but their script, their drawing routine would carry them forward to the point where, in the end, all they do is to produce something that looks like a real man. Other people, other investigators took a somewhat different view, and my interpretation is much more sympathetic to this alternative view. They anticipated that if the child were given some prompts, some hints about what to draw, in other words, if their imagination of their ability to imagine the appropriate thing to draw is limited, if we supply a cue, then they should be able to continue forward and execute a drawing appropriately. So that was the basic strategy, to see whether the difficulty was at the generative beginning of the process, thinking about what to do, or whether the difficulty was at the second stage of the process, executing with your drawing skills the idea that you have come up with. So essentially, these experiments consisted in presenting children with a cue, a prompt, a kind of suggestion about what they might draw. So here's a study by Bertie and Freeman. They asked 5 and 9-year-olds to draw a man who doesn't exist. And in the first place, they reproduced Carmeloff Smith's results. The 5-year-olds mostly failed, whereas the 9-year-olds mostly succeeded. But then they tried their prompting cue to see whether the 5-year-olds would improve. So here's what they did. Some children were simply given a verbal prompt. Do you know how a drawing of a man who doesn't exist could be done? it could be done with 2 heads. Do you think you could do that? In addition, to give children even more help, they were invited to shut their eyes and try to imagine the picture of a man with 2 heads. As you'll see in a moment, it didn't make much difference whether the child got this initial prompt or this supplementary prompt. So following either of these external prompts, most of the 5-year-olds were successful in producing an impossible man. Similar rates of success in the 2 conditions. So you can see with the 1 prompt and with the supplementary prompt, we have about 75% averaged of success rate, as opposed to the children who still have difficulty, but they're in the minority now. So in other words, that simple intervention of supplying the child with an idea is enough to trigger success. And you can probably see already that there are intriguing parallels between what we see in the drawing situation, in this situation, and what we saw a moment ago with respect to tool innovation. The younger children are pretty good if you help them, if you guide them and tell them what they might do, or show them what they might do. They have the executive skills, the practical skills to, for example, bend a pipe cleaner into a hook. They have the executive skills to draw a man with 2 heads. But what they lack is the imagination to think of those ideas in the first place. And that's where adults can come in and assist them. Okay, so drawing what does not exist, also rare in young children unless prompted. So to review the general point I'm trying to make here, young children's imagination tends to stick to everyday reality. They mostly imagine outcomes they've already observed. Whilst at one level we might think of this type of imagination as limited, it's actually not limited in certain contexts. It's rather good for imagining what is going to happen in the future, insofar as the future tends to reproduce what has happened in the past. That said, young children find it hard to imagine marked departures from past reality. And as we saw with the unlikely events, the alligator under the bed, they dismiss that as impossible, even though it could actually happen. And finally, children are very receptive to external prompts, suggesting that their difficulties with invention and drawing something that doesn't exist are because of their difficulty at the generative stage, the early stage of these activities, rather than the executive stage. Because if you give them the idea, they can proceed to execution. This is a very overstated simplification. We could say that young children are excellent plagiarists, but poor creators. So I'm going to stop there. If anybody after the presentation would like to be in touch, here's my email. And I think there should be adequate time for questions. So in the meantime, whilst you're thinking about your question, I'm going to stop my screen share so that I can see the audience. If I can get my yeah. Okay.
So thank you, Paul, for this presentation. Certainly, we will have some questions or remarks or comments. Yes. Juste une chose, Paul comprend le français si vous parlez lentement, donc vous pouvez aussi poser vos questions en français, il répondra en anglais. Et par contre, je vous demande de parler dans le micro pour que le son traverse l'Atlantique.
Alors, j'ai une question, Sandrine, c'est possible? Je ne sais pas parce que je ne peux pas voir l'audience. Hein.
Dani, si tu...
Alors, est-ce que tu m'écoutes ou pas?
Elle ne m'entend pas, donc.
En fait, Daniel, je peux vous écouter. Alors, si vous commencez, ça va.
OK, je pense que je ne sais pas si je parle en français ou en anglais, alors je vais essayer de parler en anglais parce que je fais mes écrits ici en anglais. Alors, c'est plus facile.
Excellent, excellent.
D'accord. So, I was trying to write all your slides and also make some questions. I've been studying imagination since 1994. And my researchers, they are a bit different from your data. So I would like to discuss them with you. First of all, my first research was about children that was resident in orphanages that were institutionalized, which means that they were apart from their families. When we organized the play situations, the make-believe situations, what we saw as the more constant events were the events that was completely united with family situations, which means that they were playing with situations that they were not familiar. So, right. Of course, we know that children, they can understand the world in a very complex way, which means they don't only relate with the world based on what they know directly, but also how they know indirectly. So that's my first question. We cannot, if maybe we could just make a contradiction and think that we cannot say that fantasy in children are realistic, which means that it's not only based in what they had lived it. So that's my first question.
I maybe answer that one before you go to the second.
Nice.
So, of course, you're right that these children lacked families of their own. Presumably, that was why they were in an orphanage. But I presume they know enough about reality to know that up to a point they were exceptional. They perhaps had memories of being with a family member at a certain point in time, unless they had spent their entire life in an orphanage. And the other thing to say is that, of course, children will be presented with a great deal of material, as you're implying, which moves them beyond their first-hand experience. In virtually every story that they read, even stories about animals, will be presenting the bears having mothers and fathers, so to speak. So when I talk about children being reality grounded or reality based, I don't mean to say that their sense of reality is strictly confined to their own personal, somewhat unusual experience. It is much broader than that. And in fact, as Danielle mentioned, I spent the last, 10, even more, 20 years thinking about how children learn a great deal from other people's testimony. So that would be my answer to your point. I can't hear you. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
It's really interesting because the point is what we are calling realistic and what we are calling memory. And if we think that memory is only what we live, then we have a problem because we can have mediated memories.
Yes. Yeah.
That's my first. The second one, one of my last research, because I've been researching play through the 30 years, is that it's also a different data from what you have said. Children I saw children with, especially children with disabilities, because I studied children with autism, children with mental deficiency, and children and blind children and their play and their imaginative development. So what we have seen in those data is that those children, they have to create a very complex dynamic in their roles, in their play, using tools in a very complex way to make sense their own play. Which means, I'm going to give you an example. I have a group of children that are blind. They are playing together. How they play? They don't have nobody to organize their play for them. So they start to speak loud. They start to make movements around the class to be together. And the movement of their bodies and the movement of the language and the intensity of the language organize the role and organize the tools. So this idea of flexibility of tools, and maybe we need to understand facing the specificities that we have in children's development. That's my point of view. I don't know, I'd like to hear you. What do you think about it? Thank you so much.
Annie, maintenant, tu coupes ton micro, puis ensuite on donnera la parole à la salle. Merci. Paul, à toi.
So, yes, I must admit I haven't thought very carefully, and I should do more thinking about children with the kind of sensory handicaps that you're talking about, particularly blind children. Having said that, I mean, what research I do know of with respect to blind children suggests that their ideas about reality, mediated, of course, by language, are not very radically different from that of a sighted child. So even with respect to color vocabulary, they are remarkably capable. So again, it would depend upon what we think of as the sources of information for the nature of reality. And like you, I'm sympathetic to the idea that it's not just first-hand experience. In the case of blind children, I think you're right. It must be, there is kind of existence proof of the richness with which a notion of reality could be constructed on the strength of communication, as opposed to first-hand experience. So that would be my preliminary answer. But maybe you should send me your data so that I can think about it more slowly. Very good.
Hi, Paul. Thanks. That was really interesting and very clear. To draw a spectrum in a slightly different way, there's what we might call the Vygotskian perspective of Michael Tomasello versus the anti-Vygotskian perspective of Meltzoff and Moore. And I would have thought that Susan Carey belongs to the anti-Vygotskian side of that, and they would say that kids are in some way born with innate concepts and an innate understanding of physics. And looking at your data, I guess they might be quite happy to say that the creativity is sort of almost epiphenomenal on the biological development that happens anyway, and that it's that rather than anything cultural historical, which is in the lead. Yeah, so I wonder whether you'd have a response to Meltzoff and Moore or Gopnik. I'm thinking like the study with the infants that apparently when there's violations of physics that they observe, they stick their tongue out and that sort of stuff, which is quite explicitly challenging people like Tomasello, Jeremy Carpendale, who say that social learning is kind of important. Or another way to say it is like cause versus effect. Like, is the imitation and creativity actually causing development, or is there development happening anyway, and it happens to involve these creative activities just by the by?
So I guess I wouldn't have placed people like Susan Carey so much in opposition to people like Mike Tomasello, in the sense that certainly if we take Susan Carey, she spent her whole life thinking about conceptual change. So she's no nativist. She might be more of, if we take Liz Spelke, her colleague, those two would probably not agree, in the sense that Spelke is more inclined to think about the presence of core knowledge. But you're right in the sense that if I sympathize with any of these protagonists, it's probably more with the conceptual change advocates like Susan Carey than the more nativist approach. But in some ways, I don't think that particular question matters too much for the claims I'm making, because whether the child's knowledge of reality is boosted by some kind of innate component, or whether the child starts off with a very modest sketch of what reality is like and then has to fill in a lot of the gaps by virtue of interaction and communication, I would still argue, irrespective of the source of the information about reality, so to speak, that it's these notions of reality that feed into the child's pretend play. And to be honest, I can give you a nice illustration of both the more, what can we say, culturally invariant components and the more culturally variable components. So there's a recent study also done in a traditional community in Africa, again, an observational study of pretend play. And on the one hand, we see the kinds of activities that I mentioned earlier, the use of containers, pretend pouring, and so forth, where I'm presuming that the child's naive physics, however it comes about, is brought to bear. So in that sense, we see something that's very similar to the studies I described earlier, with the toy horse being either powdered or wetted. But within that same community, there's some intriguing evidence that boys and girls start to diverge, with the boys engaging in more masculine activities, pretend hunting, and the girls engaging in more female activities, pretend cooking, for example. So one would be tempted to interpret those findings in terms of the child being, an anthropologist who's studying gender roles in his or her community and acting accordingly. I guess one could even make a nativist argument for that, but I would hesitate to go there myself. So anyway, my rather long-winded answer is that I don't think the debate that you are talking about between the more nativist and the more constructivist, I don't care too much how it turns out, because my argument would be the more important thing is to ask, where does the child get inspired with respect to their imagination? And I'm saying their conception of reality, however achieved.
Paul Harris, thank you for your talk. My name is Stefanie Stadler, and I would like to challenge your conclusion. You say children are poor creators, and I would like to draw attention to a domain that is under-researched, and that is singing development, vocal development. And from my research on singing development, I would say just the contrary, as you say. I would say
the songs children invent themselves spontaneously are rich, are amazingly narrative, musically rich, melodically rich, rhythmically rich. So this is not consistent, does not fit into your conclusion. So maybe you can say something on that?
Yeah. Would you say this? I mean, to be honest, I know nothing about children's choral development.
I think that's the problem, that imagination is in research sometimes thought limited to certain domains.
Yeah.
And if we don't include universal expressions like vocal expressions, singing and inventing stories, and combining even melodies with lyrics and narratives, then we miss something.
Tell me, what age are you talking about?
From 9 months to 9 years, let's say.
Okay.
Very broad, a broad time in life that we use our voice to create unbelievable patterns.
Let me just switch gears slightly by saying, what about musical composition as such? Do you see the same thing, not with respect to using the voice, but using an instrument?
Compositions would need notation, and that's already a cultural technique that is very, very complicated and very elaborate. But I mentioned just vocal expressions.
Okay.
And the capacity to use the voice to learn languages and to make music and make songs.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm on the one hand disconcerted by your question because I don't know anything about the development of singing ability. But let me at least remind myself, and perhaps all of us, that in some ways my claims are too radical. Even if we look at language, after all, one of the hallmarks of language, highlighted by Chomsky, is that language is a generative capacity with which novel, unique sentences can be produced. And children, in that sense, are as gifted as anybody else. I mean, they too produce unique sentences. And so, in that sense, the combinatorial capacities of young children are present from a very early age. So maybe the same is going on with respect to their vocal repertoire. They are, they're gifted composers in the sense that they can take some of the elements and reorder and recombine them. That's all I can say, and I thank you for challenging me, so to speak.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Paul, for your talk. I would also like to draw on this conclusion. I agree that children are not creators, and I don't think children play or are imaginative to be creators. And I think Vygotsky was more worried about the function of play and imagination for the child's psychological development, and not is it a good or bad creation? I mean, that the product was not the point. I was wondering if in your methodological design, do you ever consider, is it somehow covered the reasons why children play? Because I think Vygotsky gives a very good hint that children play to master reality, emotionally master reality, and not to create things. They relive and reenact things that they have experienced before so that they can mostly emotionally overcome and master them. Is it somehow in your methodological design this aspect, so the psychological function of imagination and the reasons why, and not really the quality? Is it a copy or original creation? Because I don't see this as being the central aspect for Vygotsky.
Well, to be honest, I didn't know that Vygotsky had made those claims about emotional mastery. Where does he make those claims?
Brolin, its development in children's mental health, right? Mental development. And imagination and creativity in childhood.
Okay. So it's, I mean, I'm intrigued that you make those assertions about him, because I hadn't really put him in that particular camp, but then, you know, I haven't made an exhaustive study of Vygotsky's pretty large oeuvre, so to speak. But it seems to me, I would like to know the evidence for that claim. So here's my hesitation. So I do know that within clinical circles, it is often asserted that children's play is a way for children to reenact challenging situations, and in some sense to master them. But I mean, the observational work that I described doesn't lead one to that conclusion. It may be that we see that happening in the setting of a clinic, but the observational studies in the United States, in Africa that I talked about, you know, the children are not reenacting emotionally charged scripts. They're reenacting pretty straightforward, pedestrian, everyday, workaday activities. The other point I would make is that when I've had discussions, I'm thinking of a particular colleague and friend who is a developmental psychologist and child therapist. What she has pointed out to me, at least, is that when you have a disturbed child, their pretend play is actually somewhat chaotic. It tends to be fragmentary and not very coherent. And she argues that in some ways, one senses as a clinician that one is making progress when the child's play becomes more organized and more sustained. So then, for me, then there's an open question as to whether, you know, the emotional conflict is something that activates children to engage in pretend play, which I'm skeptical of, or the emotional conflict is something which actually disrupts the child's play, which my colleague is in some sense attesting to from her clinical experience. So if Vygotsky is making these claims that, you know, play is a form of mastery seeking, then I would be interested in knowing what the evidence for that is, even though it is a claim that's often made by more Freudian clinicians. I'm not so convinced myself.
Thank you.
Feel free to disagree.
Within the teaching of scientific disciplines like mathematics, physics, and so on, with older children, we see similar phenomena of impossibility of solving problems without an introduction to them, without seeing something. We call them obstacles. The phenomenon is for older children, 9 years, but also 16 years. Do you think that it is similar to what you have observed or not?
Let me see if I've understood your question. Are you saying that sometimes when you're trying to teach a new concept to...
New strategies, for instance, also.
You're saying
that children doesn't succeed to produce them, even if they have at their disposal of the tools to solve the problem. There is something which they need to see an example, like in the case of the thing at the bottom of the container.
Right. So you're saying
very similar, apparently, But it is, do you think that it is the same phenomenon or not?
Well, there is a lot of work to my knowledge, in the teaching of science, especially the teaching of physical principles, suggesting that the child's intuitive knowledge of the way that the world works can sometimes be an obstacle to their assimilation of a more theoretically and scientifically correct view. But it could also be the case, I'm sympathetic to what you're suggesting, namely that in order for them to assimilate this more correct view, in some ways you have to support them by giving them a more easy to imagine or easy to visualize illustration of exactly what is happening. That would be very reasonable to me. And in some ways then, as you're pointing out, I think it would underline parallels between the challenges that older children face in the classroom and between the challenges that the younger children face with respect to the tool creation tasks. But let me just add one important footnote, which I think is very pertinent to the topic of science education. So certainly in the United States, and perhaps in other places too, the notion of the child as a hands-on learner is very popular. So if you go to the Children's Museum here in Boston, you'll find lots of displays where the child has the opportunity to touch and investigate and explore. And the basic idea, I think, is that children learn best from active hands-on exploration. And then if anything, displays that they're just supposed to look at are rejected as inadequate. I think this notion of the child as hands-on learner is overstated, precisely in the sense that I think children, under certain circumstances, but not always, but under certain circumstances, can, just like adult scientists, engage in thought experiments and learn from them. So let me just spell this thought out a little bit. So some years ago, I worked with a student, Igor Pishanjiev, on children's understanding of the tubes task. In the tubes task, there are diagonally arranged tubes that crisscross one another. And if you put a ball into one tube, of course, it falls diagonally and ends up at a different point from where it started. But when you talk to very young children, even if you put it in a diagonal tube, they think it's going to fall straight down. It's as if their understanding of gravity is too strong and overrides their ability to imagine the ball inside the tube. However, I won't go into the details, but Igor and other colleagues have tried various interventions where you simply ask the child, wait, imagine the ball inside the tube. Now, even a 2-year-old knows enough about naive physics to know that a ball cannot escape from a tube with solid walls. It is going to be obliged to stay and roll inside the tube. And it turns out that children under those circumstances with that minimal intervention do much better. They're more accurate. And with that minimal intervention, they then succeed without the prompt on subsequent trials. So what I'm trying to underline is the fact that to the extent that the child's imagination, when brought into play, delivers a correct and appropriate notion of reality, which the child doesn't necessarily do all the time because they impulsively come to a particular conclusion, rather than sitting back and engaging in a thought experiment, well, there are opportunities for using thought experiments in the classroom. And that, I think, is one of the intriguing implications of the as it were, the realist view of the imagination that I'm trying to set out, that it would imply that young children needn't necessarily be hands-on learners. They can just, as scientists sometimes do, sit and think, or as philosophers sometimes do, they engage in, hypothetical scenarios in order to push themselves toward new conclusions.
I can, but the thought experiments are something which is given, introduced.
Yeah.
Yes, that means that that there is something which comes from the environment as a cultural hint.
Yeah. I agree. The child needs to be encouraged to engage in that thought experiment. But once you ask the child to engage in it, what I'm trying to emphasize is that the child's imagination, once set in motion, can teach the child what the truth is. In other words, to the extent that the child's imagination is a laboratory, a virtual laboratory, which has certain realistic constraints built into it, it will be a pedagogic tool for the child. Although I agree with you that, of course, it might not be a tool that the child spontaneously uses. They may need some help from a teacher or from the environment to engage in that kind of a way. Children don't necessarily sit around spontaneously engaging in thought experiments.
Okay, I have a question on the chat here from Isabella Orlando. The question is, I would like to talk about the conclusion too. Based on Vygotsky's work, we see that the elements for imagination are taken from reality, but it would be a different thing to say that children are only good plagiarists, because this would mean that they can only copy what they see. However, Vygotsky says that we transform those elements from reality through a complex internal process. Could Paul discuss this, please?
Yes, it's a fair point. When I introduced that statement at the end, I said it was a bit of an exaggeration. And of course, in the course of these questions and answers, the notion of children being able to creatively recombine the elements has come to the fore, and in that sense, I'm sympathetic to Vygotsky. Although where we, of course, are both in agreement, I am in agreement with Vygotsky, is that the elements themselves are drawn from reality. It's rather than the child inventing a fantastical world with radically different causal properties. And as we were discussing earlier, the same would be true of the child's ability to use language. If the child were merely capable of copying what was said, the child's conversation would be extremely dull. But children's conversation is rich and creative, and they are able to recombine elements. So, okay, I should modify my slogan. It's an overstatement, and thank you for pointing that out.
Bernard?
Yes, I like it. Child is not the creator. The question is to ask, what does this sentence mean? I would say he or she is not a creator in the sense that when the child is creative, the aim of its creation is not to create something, but the aim, and I come back to what Priscilla said before, the aim is to do something about one or herself. What is created goes back to the inner life of the child. And even so straightforward activities like cooking or pouring or whatever else, this has a very important function of constructing his or her own personality. In the sense that I wanted to ask you back, why then, if not to master themselves and to master reality, do children play? Just for fun. So that's the question I would like to ask you. Why do these children play?
Yes, it's the so-called $64,000 question. I myself, in thinking about that, have been tempted to speculate in a more evolutionary fashion. So I sketched some ideas in my earlier book, which Daniel mentioned, on the imagination. And the theme that I emphasized was that if we think about human beings and their, we are an unusual species in all sorts of ways. But the archaeological record underlines the fact that at certain points in time, it's clear that human beings are beginning to plan with a long-range future in mind. So they go elsewhere and secure materials and bring them back over long distances and construct sites, or they construct dwellings or ornaments. And more generally, the neurological evidence suggests that planning and the functions of the frontal cortex are distinctive in human beings. So I guess my own speculation has been that in order to plan, one needs to imagine. And so that seems to be something which is very rich and potent in human beings. And if anything, then I've postponed the question of why it is that children engage in pretend play as such, by simply underlining the fact that in their pretend play, they're showing this ability to draw on their knowledge of reality and to reenact what it might be like, which I see as vital for engaging in the kind of future planning which would be adaptive, so to speak, for human beings. So in other words, whilst I think it's not so difficult to think in terms of planning being something that was selected for from an evolutionary point of view, it's much less clear to me what would be the advantage conferred on a child who engages in a lot of pretend play as opposed to very little pretend play. And so I get a bit stuck at that point, precisely because, to the best of our knowledge, irrespective of cultural scaffolding, we see pretend play emerging all around the world at roughly the same age. So evolution, for whatever reason, has done its best to ensure that children engage in it. But I don't have a ready and crystal clear account of why they do so, other than to say, well, I see it as part of this broader capacity to visualize and envisage the future. So I'm not really answering your question, but it's a good one.
And now it's the end. Thank you, Paul, for your conference. Your very interesting conference. You create some conflict in your minds, and you stimulate our imagination. Thank you very much.
Very good. enjoy the rest of your day. And I wish, oui, je regrette que je suis pas là.
Nous aussi. Thank you.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Ok, au revoir.
Au revoir.